Welcome to the Trend Detection Podcast, powered by Siemens. And now your host, Niall Sullivan.
Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the Trend Detection Podcast. I'm really pleased to have my colleague, David Peterson, on. It's been a little while since you've been on, David. Actually, I think the last time you were on, we were talking about data, I believe, a very data-focused conversation. But today, we're actually going to focus on something completely different to that. Or maybe it's related, we'll find out. But in my mind, completely different. It's all about RFPs and predictive maintenance and what should be covered in them. And David's someone who I think has had lots of experience in that area, has had to work on lots of RFPs, has spoken to customers, so he's a great person to have on to discuss this. But I guess, David, first of all, maybe if you'd like to introduce yourself to the audience and just your role at Siemens as well.
Thank you, Niall. It's good to be back. So I'm David Peterson. I'm a solutions engineer with Siemens and Senseye. So what I do is I look at the situation with prospects, with customers, and try to determine is the data maturity where it needs to be in order to execute a properly implemented predictive maintenance program. I look for gaps. I look for areas to give recommendations on how to improve the likelihood of a successful POC. And I work very closely with the customer to make sure that everything is exactly as desired.
Excellent. And and working closely with the customer is very good. Seeing into our topic today. So like we said, we wanted to talk about RFPs, which isn't something we traditionally talk about on the podcast, but it's quite an important topic because traditionally with big companies, this is how they assess vendors and how they go to market to find vendors for predictive maintenance and a whole host of other solutions. But I guess first of all, David, for people who don't know, what is an RFP? Let's start from ground zero, from the start.
It stands for Request for Proposal, and sometimes we have people that kind of mix it up with an RFI, Request for Information, or it can sometimes be used analogous with RFQ, Request for Quotation. It will typically include items such as the scale, the scope of what they're trying to include in the proposal, the timing, many times they'll ask for commercial considerations. And of course, they want to make sure that the technical answer is going to be enough to cover their desired outcome.
And I guess, first of all, what are the sort of key components that should make up an RFP specifically for a predictive maintenance solution in your eyes?
So that's a very good question. Typically, there are going to be several areas that are included or should be included. And let me see if I can name off a few. That would be like, would data infrastructure be needed? Would there be anything needed for the solution to be implemented or deployed on site? What sensors or measures does the solution need in order for a predictive maintenance program to be put in place? What about security? Most companies are very concerned about data security, which leads me to the next question. What about data ownership? Who owns the data? We have seen times where some competitors will own the data of the production data of the customer, and they don't share. So you want to make sure we want the prospect to understand that you want to own your own data. We want to talk about scalability. What works well on a very small scale may not necessarily apply applicably, or may not apply equally across multiple locations, maybe, or across the world. We want to look at the user interface. How intuitive is it? How easy is it for all levels to use this? You may have someone who may be highly technical, or you may have someone who's maybe on the corporate side who wants to be able to see what's going on. But you also want to make sure that the solution has the ability for your maintainers to be able to easily interface with it. You would not have to become a data scientist to figure out what's going on. And along those lines, you want to make sure you have customizable dashboards. So you're displaying the information that you want to see. That goes into reporting. So when the corporate ownership wants to take a look at how's the efficiency of this program running and how's the efficiency of the maintenance going, you want to be able to have data that's available for quick dispersal. You want to be able to have fleet analysis. You may have multiple assets that are common across lines, common across areas, common across different locations throughout the fleet, throughout the world. You want to make sure that you can do some analysis on some of those measures as well. You want the ability for anytime you have a predictive maintenance program, you want to have the ability to use derived measures or virtual measures. For instance, you may have a valve that you have an upstream pressure and a downstream pressure, but you don't have any way to measure flow across the valve seat. You want to be able to understand what's going on there through using virtual or derived measures. And finally, this is a really important part, and that is, if you consider that most locations, most factories, most plants are a combination of different machines, different assets built by different companies that speak different data languages, you want to make sure that the solution has been designed for agnostic applicability. How widely applicable is the solution across all assets, regardless of who makes them? Can the information be moved across different networks you have, whether that's going to be an Ethernet or a mobile network or maybe a LoRa one or whatever it happens to be? You want the solution to be incredibly smooth to apply across all situations you have in your plant. That's probably one of the biggest issues that I think is going to be important, that and scalability. So kind of a long answer. Hopefully that will cover what I typically will see in an RFP that comes to me, those kinds of things. Oh, then, of course, there would be the delivery schedule. What can they count on? Something of that nature. So we want to make sure those are all covered.
Well, I think that's covered the whole episode then. So we're done. So we covered what's in an RFP. So no, that's really good. That's really detailed. And I think the thing to me that springs to mind actually is that people going into this process really need to think about, it's not a short-term thing, it's actually the long-term. Because some of those things you said about scalability and does it fit within the infrastructure, these aren't just short-term measures. They're also, you got to think about, future scaling and future deployment, right? Not just the short term.
Exactly. I've heard a number that a very large percentage, something like 80% of internal predictive maintenance programs fail. They don't quite understand that what works on a small lab-like situation just does not scale across multiple asset types, multiple networks, and multiple machine languages. So yeah, that's a really important point.
And I guess to that point, you mentioned many different areas, which and many different things that maybe should be included in RFP. But how do you then turn that into something that attracts like qualified, vendors as well? Because I guess people, you might get lots of submissions, lots of interest from vendors, but you don't want to go through a long list. Or maybe you do. You could tell me different. But is there a way to qualify vendors for an RFP?
We've seen a number of different approaches, some more efficient, some more detailed than others. What I've seen, the most efficient programs typically will have a large, and I hate to call it this, but a cattle call. Come one, come all, come on. And they'll send out an initial RFI, or a request for information, and they'll have some specific questions about areas of concern, which implies they actually understand what the problem is. Sometimes we'll see RFPs that come through or RFIs where they don't quite understand the problem. They just know they're hemorrhaging cash or they're hurting somewhere and they need to find a fix somehow. But they haven't come up with a detailed understanding of what their issues are in the first place. So first we need to understand what matters, what KPI are going to be significant. Invite a number of people to come through. And what we've seen is a number of down selecting steps. So you may have 15 or 20 of a down select right off the top. Maybe drop it down to 5. From there, drop it down to 2 or 3, and then make a final selection on who's going to receive the contract. But we tend to see a tiered approach as being the most effective way to get the breadth of responses, primarily because many of our competitors have a different approach than we do. And conversely, we actually have a unique approach that's different than maybe the old school standard PDM type programs. And so you want to cast a net that's big enough to capture all of the approaches, and then you can down select from there in terms of what matters to your company.
I guess what's at the core to all of this is understanding what you're trying to solve to start with. What are the business problems you're trying to solve, right? Then that's your starting point for knowing what questions you want or what you want from a vendor, right?
Exactly. And that may include something like, we talk about predictive maintenance as avoiding unplanned downtime. Well, it could be maybe environmental sustainability. Maybe you're getting eaten up by fines from the environmental regulatory agency, or it could be maybe there's a spare parts inventory issue that you're having to deal with, or maybe the actual cost of the downtime is in the quality of the product gets compromised in advance of the downtime by a certain degree and after startup. So you've lost a lot of product. And just through quality issues related to a downtime that's coming up or an unplanned downtime. So yes, I would completely agree with that assessment that you gave now.
And I guess it's also thinking about, when we're talking about trying to attract a broad range of criteria, because I guess we know in our market, David, with Senseye Predictive Maintenance, there's a lot of competitors out there. We don't want to focus too much on competitors, but in terms of some that offer very basic solutions, some that are very advanced solutions, is that the kind of variety you mean, or do you need to be more focused if you want something that's more specialized? Is that better, or is it better to go broader?
Oh, that's a good question. Now that's let me see if I can answer that in a way that's succinct, but yet covers the topic. If you look at a lot of the OEM type machinery that gets brought into the system, into your plant or into your factory, many of those will come with OEM based sensing. It could be current, it could be torque, it could be temperature. You may get something coming along with the PLCs. You may have on-off signals or something of that nature. And then someone will come in and talk to the customer and they'll say, hey, you know what? Hey, vibration is the end all be all of predictive maintenance. And while it's very effective in certain areas, in niche areas, there are a lot of different assets that you have that simply will not be and cannot be understood through vibration. For instance, an AC/DC drive. There's nothing that a vibration sensor would offer me. So when you look at the different predictive maintenance companies, you want to understand what is the breadth and depth of their experience in all types of assets, whether that's going to be in rotating assets or linear assets or electrical assets or pick and place or production machines. You want to make sure that the company that you're working with can actually work with all of your asset types, and that's going to be important.
No, absolutely. And if we sort of flip this on its head, I guess, as well. So we've talked about what should be included, but what are some of the common sort of pitfalls people fall into with RFPs? Which maybe are common, but maybe wouldn't be necessarily the recommended approach, or leads them down a path maybe which they shouldn't be going down.
There's an old phrase that says a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. I would agree with that. Many times we'll get an RFP coming in where maybe the maintenance team or the data scientists have a specific solution type or solution approach in mind. And so they'll craft the RFP around a specific approach only, which automatically disqualifies, say, 85% of the other groups that are trying to approach that. So for instance, if you talk about, hey, this has to have a, and this, I don't want to sound derogatory, but if you wanted to use an old school type of having a data scientist come in, study the state of the asset for 6 to 9 months, come up with an algorithm, begin testing it, do your training of the model. That's all nice and good, and it has worked in times past, but it's not scalable because individual assets, the exact same model of individual assets will behave very differently depending on the application that they're inserted into, or depending on who's maintaining them, or depending on whether they're located on the first floor or on the third floor, or next to a door that's open to the environment. There's just so many different components out there that an old school approach may not necessarily be the best. So what we would do is we would say, don't come in with your biases in place. Or if you come up with just a little bit of understanding of what PDM is, but you're trying to learn more through the RFP, allow for the idea that there may be better options out there than it was that other than the 20, 30, 40-year-old options of data scientists and modeling.
Yeah. And that's interesting what you say, David, about previous experience as well. Because what I've written down here is that there also that conscious, so maybe unconscious bias of previous projects. Like maybe projects that didn't
right.
That failed for whatever reason. There's a number of reasons why, but does that sometimes come into the thinking when they're developing a new RFP? It's like they've been burnt before, so that alters how they put that together.
Absolutely. We can't help but be impacted by the experiences of the past. I mean, that's who we are. And so sometimes you get someone who will try to control the process a little tighter, but it ends up burning them because they didn't quite understand why it failed in the first place. And so my advice is, when you craft an RFP, craft it to be open enough to allow for the idea that there's different ways to approach something. For instance, rather than do the data scientist and the model, we actually come up with a very advanced pattern matching algorithm that we use. So if I can look at an asset and I'd see how it's performing, I look at the temperature, torque, current, vibration, whatever it happens to be, under normal running conditions for each particular recipe or regime. Within about 72 hours, what we'll do is we'll actually identify what that would look like, and then we compare it with real data. So we can actually get results literally within the first week of, is there a problem coming up with the system that we can point to in the future?
Please like and subscribe on all major podcast channels, and find out more about Senseye Predictive Maintenance at Siemens.com.